my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the ChangeStories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the ChangeStories podcast. My guest today is Dr Terri Simpkin. Terri, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to speak with you again, Susanne.
It's been a while. We were just chatting before we started recording. It's got to be probably about 5 years since we last spoke to each other, I think. So it's great to see you. Let me do a little bit of an introduction. So Terri is Associate Professor of Management at the University of Tasmania. She's also the CEO of Mischief Business Engineering and the founder of At Braver, Stronger, Smarter and for fakesake.org. She is an internationally experienced research-informed practitioner who's worked internationally with governments, industry associations, large organisations and SMEs. And she is a sought-after public speaker and facilitator and a Churchill Fellow, and an authority on the imposter phenomenon, which I'm really looking forward to talking to you about today. It's something that I keep hearing about, and I know that you are the person to speak to about it. So I'm really glad that you're here.
Thank you. It's a topic after my own heart, I have to say. I'm sure we'll get onto why that is as we discuss everything about the imposter phenomenon.
Well, maybe let's start there. So, first of all, it's phenomenon rather than a syndrome, isn't it? I know that's something you feel very strongly about.
I do, and I have been threatening for years to have that put on a T-shirt, and I actually have had a couple of T-shirts printed with "It's not a bloody syndrome." So. It's never been a syndrome. It's known as a phenomenon, and the first people to look at this, Pauline Rose-Clance and Susanne Evans, theorized the construct way back in the late or mid to late 70s, and they called it a phenomenon for a reason, because it's a bit difficult to actually pin down. And we might talk about that as we go through our discussion. But it has never been recognised as a syndrome. It appears on no lists of medical syndromes at all. And in fact, there are a number of characteristics that sort of situated outside of the definition of it being a syndrome. So I do get exercised about the whole notion of people calling it a syndrome, because it sort of makes it sound like a mental health condition, which it isn't. And if people are feeling stigmatized by that, then they will tend to have a fear about talking about it or exploring their experiences, which means that they tend not to put it out there or tell people about it or seek some sort of assistance. And that means that people are sitting there, experiencing this perhaps over the long term, when in fact they don't need to. So the whole point of calling it the tragedy of calling it a syndrome is that people do find themselves or feel stigmatized by that term. And so we really do need to move away from it. So now we're calling it either a phenomenon, although it is, syndrome is easier to say, phenomenon's a bit of a mouthful. So it's also known as an experience, or sometimes it's called imposterism in the literature. So as long as you don't call it a syndrome, I'd be much happier.
I definitely won't. But I'm really interested as to how that happened. I find there's similar things in the field of change. So the change curve, for example, is trotted out as the thing about change, or the fact that 70% of change fails. Neither of which are true, but they become a myth. They become part of the sort of story of change management, and this has become part of the story of imposter phenomenon. I find that really intriguing, that it's the idea of it's a syndrome has really stuck, hasn't it?
It has. And look, I couldn't tell you when it actually happened. It just seems to have crept into the literature. I mean, even in the academic literature, it is identified in some research papers as a syndrome, or people will start calling it a syndrome, and then they'll put in brackets imposter phenomenon. So they're sort of hedging their bets. So I actually can't answer the question where it actually came from. It just sort of sprang up in the literature somewhere, and people have picked it up and run with it. And of course, social media have landed on this idea of imposter syndrome. And if you actually Google imposter syndrome and imposter phenomenon, imposter syndrome in terms of hits will win out, which is a real shame, because that notion of it being a medicalized condition, which of course it isn't, is being perpetuated in social media across the board. So it sort of is about pushing back on that moniker to make sure that people are less likely to fall on the side of syndrome and get comfortable with the idea of phenomenon or experience. I think over the longer term, we'll probably see it shift, but for the minute, social media are trotting it out as a syndrome left, right, and centre. Sadly,
how frustrating!
It is a bit frustrating.
I was quite interested to see. So in the last few weeks, just purely by chance, I've had quite a few conversations about the topic with a variety of groups of people, totally unrelated, and they have all been calling it imposter phenomenon, which I thought would please you. It's yes, it's out there. It's out there and getting traction.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
So how did you start?
I do have rants on social media occasionally. I do get a bit ranty.
I know you do. Like you're a one-woman crusade. Well, we'll all help. All the listeners will help.
Thank you. Thank you.
How did, as a topic for you, how did you first become interested in it and decide to make it the focus of your work and your study?
Yeah, it actually happened. I can pinpoint the actual day that it popped into my head as being something that I really wanted to look into. It was the day that I actually handed in my PhD thesis. So for many years, I had been feeling like I shouldn't have been at university. I was a mature age student. I came from a low socioeconomic background. I grew up in the East End of London, and then in a low socioeconomic council estate in Colchester, actually. Although I appear to have this wacky Australian accent, I am actually English. So I had this background, and I found myself at university thinking, A, I shouldn't be here, B, somebody's made a mistake and let me in, and C, I keep getting all these really good marks. I'm sure someone has made an administrative error, but I'm not going to say anything just in case they actually realise that I shouldn't be here and say, thanks very much, but no thanks. And so when I got through my undergraduate degree, I did an honours degree, and then went into a PhD. When I was asked whether I wanted to do a PhD, I literally laughed in the face of the academic who suggested that they supervise me. I said, I'm lucky to have got through my undergrad degree, let alone, put myself into a position where I'm, really going to put myself out there in terms of PhD study. And they said, no, you've got this track record. You're on the Dean's honour roll. You're up there in terms of scholarly academic achievement. We'd be really pleased to have you in the PhD program. So I spent 5 years going through the program, and every time I turned up to my supervisory meetings, I was expecting them to say, yeah, it's just not working for us. Thanks very much. And then I sort of got towards the end of those 5 years, and I thought, well, they're just actually being nice to me. They're going to wait for the external examiners to actually tell me that my work was, rubbish and that I should never have been accepted into the program. And I'm absolutely convinced of this. And it wasn't about, seeking reassurance or being humble. I was absolutely convinced that the next supervisory session was going to be the one where they would call me out. Anyway, that never happened. And so I got through, and these were in the days where you actually had the physical hard copy and you had to take it to an office and hand it in. And so I was sitting in my car outside the university building, and I had these two massive tomes on my lap, and I couldn't get out of my car. I was absolutely pinned into my seat, and I sat there thinking, for a good half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, how can I actually get out of this? Because I know in my bones that when I hand this thing in is going to be the point at which someone is going to find me out. And this thing is going to be out there in the world, and I'm going to be exposed for the failure that I am, and that, you know, the external examiners are going to, you know, call into question why I should have been in the program, that, you know, my family were going to be disappointed because they were all sort of all, you know, people first in family going to university and now she's doing a PhD. I would have had to hand back all the money that the government had given me to actually do the study, which was another point of stress. You know, oh my God, you know, the government has given me this big bucket of money to do this, and now I'm going to be called out as a phony. And literally, I couldn't get out of the car, and I was racking my brains as how I could actually get out of this, up to and including sort of thoughts of about self-harm, which really, really sort of made me frightened. Anyway, I managed to get out of the car, handed it in, and got home and thought, there must be, this has to happen to other people. What the hell is going on? You know, outwardly confident, you know, have, you know, as I said, got really good marks, but I just couldn't internalize all of that stuff. And so I started looking for what was going through my head, mainly because I was really quite frightened by the thoughts that I was having. And sure enough, pops up, you know, in imposter phenomenon. And I thought, oh, so I started going down rabbit holes, and of course, being a bit nerdy, it sort of exploded to something that went beyond, you know, a personal a Google search, to something that has become now, what, that was 2011. So it's been, you know, a while now that I've actually made this my primary area of academic investigation. And so, so since then, I've, you know, done my own research. Obviously, have built, you know, workshops and done countless, you know, seminars and talking to people such as yourself, just to get the message out there that, you know, this is a thing. It's actually something out there in the world. And so that's essentially where it came from. It was because I frightened myself with my own inner monologue. And wow. And of course, other people are, you know, having those same sorts of conversations with themselves, you know, sometimes every day. So yeah, it's and it is a much broader and much more complex construct than social media would have us believe. So digging in underneath that was, you know, is something that, you know, it astonishes me every day how we can reconceive of this. And, you know, reading the research, because there's so much research going on, you know, in Australia, in New Zealand, huge amount going on in North America, and in Europe, of course. So it has, like you say, it's become a topic of great academic and, you know, popular interest.
It's, I mean, it's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing it. It resonates with me deeply, in terms of, I felt the same through my entire PhD process. Interestingly, when I was at university first time around, I didn't, and I don't know whether that was because I was younger and hadn't experienced the world in quite the same way. But going back to academia in my 30s to do my PhD, I really struggled, and I felt like I shouldn't be there. I didn't know how to write academically. I found it so difficult. And when we first met, I was going through a very difficult period of my studies, when I actually decided to take a break for a while to kind of get my head around it all. And you were incredibly supportive and helpful, and I thank you for that from the bottom of my heart. But what I was struggling with, I realised through having lots of coaching and support, was I didn't want to hand it in, because I was scared of what would happen when I handed it in. And I can remember sitting with my coach, Rebecca, and getting, you know, really unpicking what it was. And I thought people would laugh. That's genuinely what I thought their reaction would be, that people would fall about laughing. And yeah, of course, you unpick that a bit more and you realise, well, no, they won't. Because even if they did think it was laughable, they're not going to do it to your face. You know, it's not how people are. It's not how the academic world is. But I really struggled with that. And your story resonates really strongly. But interestingly, I hadn't felt like that before. So when I did my first degree, not at all, none of that. Is that because I was younger? Is that how it works?
Well, this is a really interesting, you know, conversation or area of conversation to get into, because it does lend itself to answering the question as to why it isn't a syndrome. It is context bound. So it's not something, people often say, oh, I've got imposter syndrome, or they've got imposter syndrome, or insert celebrity name here is being diagnosed with imposter syndrome and they've got it. Well, you don't have it, you experience it. And it can appear in one context and not another. It can happen at one life stage and not another. So you might experience it at university, having never experienced it in school. You could experience it in one workplace and not another. So if it was a syndrome, you would be carrying that around with you all the time. So if it's context bound, then it's got to have something to do with what's going on around you. And this is one of the key messages that I have sort of felt the need to express through my work and through talking to people such as yourself, is that a lot of the work situates it as something that exists inside the individual's head, and it is their problem to solve. Where in fact, if it's context bound, then there's something going on out in the world that's prompting it or fueling it, or your experiences are bouncing off things that are going on in the workplace. And often that is the sense of otherness. So erroneously, people often think that it is a female thing, that it's women who get imposter phenomenon, and that's absolutely not true. We know that that men and women, there's not necessarily been a huge amount of work done on people who identify differently in terms of gender, but we know that men and women experience this. So it's not a female thing, but it is often experienced by females who are in occupations where they are in the minority. It is often experienced by people who are perhaps othered in some way. So it could be women in male-dominated environments. It could be people from different cultural backgrounds. For me, it was social class and my age. Yeah. I was surrounded by people who were much, much younger than me, who were doing different things than me, had different life experiences and different obligations and different interests and whatever. So coming to that space, I felt other. Weirdly, my area of academic interest at the time was occupational decision making. So I was unpacking all of the storytelling and sense making people go through in order to land in an occupation. And so I was reading all of this literature that said people like me don't go to university. Not only do they not go to university, but they're almost absent from, in any great numbers in PhD programs. So I'm sitting here thinking, I'm sort of feeling a bit other here. And the literature is saying, well, yes, actually you are. So when you find yourself in a position where the systems and the structures, and in some cases behaviors, perhaps in the workplace, are making you feel other, then that is fertile ground for the imposter phenomenon to flourish. It doesn't necessarily follow that if you feel other, then you'll experience IP. That's not what I'm saying. It's that there is an opportunity for it to kick in if there is this underpinning notion that I feel other, therefore I may feel less than, therefore I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. Can't see anybody like me here, so how is it that I'm here? Is it luck? Is it people just being nice to me? Is it because of some, random policy of the workplace that wants to get people like me into positions of, certain positions and I've got here and I really shouldn't be here? So it's those sorts of narratives that play out. So it's not so much gender or social class or neurodiversity or racial background or any other form of otherness. It is otherness in context, if that makes sense. So
it does. Yeah. Very interesting. I think for me, that explains why that was so difficult for me, because I did spend a lot of my time wandering around campus looking at the other students and thinking, well, I could basically be your mum. It's like it was very bizarre.
But at the end of the day, you've got every right to be there. You've got the capability to be there. It's just that the internal narrative is saying, look, there's nobody else like me here, ergo my story must be true. Yes. My internal narrative that is telling me that I shouldn't be here, and the social narratives that are saying I shouldn't be here, are kicking in and being made true by what I'm seeing around me. So, some of the, the bigger, master narratives that we subscribe to, things like, for example, again, coming from low socioeconomic bound and a background and a family that sort of didn't really get the whole academic thing from an early age. I was always thought of as being a bit weird because I was, quite academic as a child. And it was, the narrative there was, well, nobody likes a big head. Not, put a lid on it, put a lid on your achievements because, what are you no good? Are we not good enough for you anymore? If you're looking for social mobility and you're looking to perhaps, advance your own position and standing or opportunities in the world, it's, well, it was good, that was good enough for us. Is it not good enough for you? So there's a whole raft of other master narratives that are sitting outside the person's head, which are also speaking to them saying, you shouldn't be there. Where in fact, you need to, we need to push back on that, because that in that space is where you see stereotyping and bias and a raft of other structural barriers that keep people out of certain occupations or certain spaces.
And I think that the idea of the story and the narrative is obviously something I'm interested in because of the whole storytelling piece. But I do think from my own experience, that's what happened to me. That's what helped me, was actually getting some support from my coach to challenge those stories and narratives that I was telling myself. And I can remember sitting with her and me telling her that, they're all going to laugh. And I remember she just said to me, is that true? And it was like, oh. And that was immediately started to break it down. So I'm really interested in your view on these stories that we tell ourselves, our inner monologue, as you said, that has a huge impact, doesn't it, on how this affects us?
Yeah, and I think that, again, that gives us some hints at why this shouldn't be thought of as a syndrome, because it's learned. We learn these internal monologues. They come from somewhere. They don't just pop into our heads out of the ether, at 30 when you're doing your PhD, or when you're perhaps moving into alternate occupations or looking for promotions, or just going to work every day. They don't just sort of arrive in our heads. They're things that we've learned as we've grown up. And so this idea of unpacking those narratives is really key, in my opinion, to actually challenging those notions. Because what we're doing, and I mean, as you know, humans look for confirmation of their own stories. They're looking for evidence to make their story true. So if you're constantly feeling that you shouldn't be in a certain space, or that at some point or another someone's going to laugh at you, or that people are going to find out that you're faking it, and that all of the achievements that you've had are attributable to luck, or people being nice to you, or other people's work, or some random process of osmosis, if you're unable to internalize your own achievements, that is making that story true. And so you'll discount all of the good feedback, all of the success, all of the track record of achievement that you've had. And you'll discount that because, no, your story must be true. So I'm looking for evidence that supports that, rather than challenging those learned narratives with this stuff that, is telling us that we're actually good at what we're doing and we should be in the spaces that we're in. Because we know that, particularly from the very first work that was done by Clance and Imes, is that this is something that is experienced often by people who are very high achievers, who outwardly look confident and capable, but inside they're just a mess of cyclical self-doubt. And so, again, coming back to the social media checklist, do these 5 things to cure your imposter syndrome, drives me nuts, because I'll write down your achievements, and I'm just going, but people who are invested in their own imposter narratives don't see their achievements. They genuinely don't see them and accept them as theirs. So asking somebody to sit down and just go, I'm just going to write down these achievements that I've had, it doesn't happen. I'll just go out there and ask for feedback. Well, no, I mean, I know from a comment that one of the people in my research said, and she expressed it beautifully. We were talking about getting feedback in the workplace, particularly through performance management. And she said, oh, look, I can't talk about it. My toes are curling just thinking about getting feedback. I would much prefer to hear somebody give me criticism than telling me how good I am and you know how well I've worked and what successes. I just can't take that on. So to ask somebody to tell somebody to go out and get some feedback, it's like, well, that's not good, because if I go out and ask someone for feedback, like you thought, they're just going to laugh in my face.
Yeah.
I'm not going to invite somebody to tell me that I'm a fraud and a phony and I shouldn't be doing so. So those sorts of, you know, glib, do these 5 things, tick them off, and you'll be cured. It is much deeper for many people than, you know, the surface level self-doubt, which pretty much everybody experiences, but not everybody experiences the imposter, more complicated, long-standing, and cyclical experience of you know, thoughts and thought patterns and behaviors. So it is deeply complex.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, you're right. I was imagining myself in that situation, you know, when I have experienced these episodes throughout my life, feeling like this. The last thing I'd have wanted is to ask someone, well, how do you think I'm getting on? Because they might just confirm what I already think.
Well, actually, we're hoping you were going to ask because we think you're a fake.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
do your desk and hop it. Yeah.
Thank goodness. Off you go. Yeah.
I mean, we can joke about these things, but some of the people that I spoke to as part of my research were deeply, deeply distressed by this. So again, those glib, you know, listicle things that make it sound like you can just get over it if you just sort of have, you know, sit down, have a cup of tea, and had a good hard chat to yourself. That is not the case for many people. For many people, this is a lifelong experience that causes intense distress. And of course, we know that while there's no causal link in the literature, because it's a difficult thing to unpack, but we know that the experience of IP is associated with anxiety, with stress, with depression, with self-handicapping, and a whole raft of other things that can really impact a person personally and professionally, and it can be a lifelong experience. So, you know, I do sort of, again, get a bit, you know, ranty when, you know, particularly people on social media think that they're putting out helpful stuff to the world, where in fact they really don't understand the construct and they don't understand how weighty it can be for a lot of people.
And I guess whilst it might be helpful for people to know they're not alone, and this is something that a lot of people experience, that doesn't actually help, does it? It doesn't make you feel any better necessarily knowing it's not just you. Maybe it does, I don't know.
Well, I think naming it up and actually putting a name to it. People have said, I'm so glad that I've got a name for it, because, you know, often people think that there is, you know, something seriously wrong with their, you know, with the way that they're actually appearing in the world. And so for them to actually have a name and to say, okay, well, look, this has been studied for, you know, 40 odd years, that other people have experienced it and other people have actually used different mechanisms to either diminish their experience or, you know, put interventions in their way so that they know what's coming and can head off some of those experiences or those feelings and behaviors of the past. Once they actually understand that this is a thing and it's not them, you know, sort of being in a space where they can't do something about it, I think that's useful.
Yes.
But it's generally speaking, particularly for those people who experience it on an intense level, like some people that I spoke to were experiencing this every single day. Just the experience of going to work would, you know, cause them to think today is the day that I'm going to get found out. And then they go home at the end of the day and they think, and then the next day, oh, well, it wasn't yesterday, so it must be today. And that's how they live their lives. So that type of experience is going to take more unpacking and more self-examination and unpacking the stories and identifying what's going on in the context and how their experience is being fueled or how it's bouncing off of systems and processes. It could even be, inherent biases in certain places. It could be, things like, inherent or structural discrimination, for example. If those sorts of things are making your story true, then you can do a whole bunch of work on yourself, but there has to be a recognition of how this is actually playing out in the world as well. And so a lot of the work today, not only in the academic literature and certainly in social media, puts it well within the individual space to get over. Oh, well, it's your problem. Where in fact the work that I've been doing, and we're starting to see it coming out in the literature now, this questioning of how much of this experience sits up here between your ears, and how much of it is actually structural. And we're seeing now that there is a recognition that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on in perhaps the workplace context that is actually structural and it's feeding it. So there is a limit to how much the individual can change themselves to diminish that experience, knowing that there's stuff going on out in the world that's actually fueling it. So coming back to your question, yes, people do find comfort in that other people are experiencing it and there is a name for it and it is a thing. But you're right. But now you know that other people experience it and it's a thing. You're going to have to do some work to get out. And it is more than you tick these 5 boxes and you'll be cured and it'll be lovely tomorrow. That is not how it works for many people.
So let's unpack that a bit. So I want to come back to the organizational bit, because I think clearly this has a huge impact in organizations, but we'll come back to that in a minute. From an individual perspective then, if someone is listening to this, nodding along and thinking, oh my goodness, that's my experience.
Yeah.
Not wishing to get into the do these 5 things and you'll be cured conversation, but what are the things that people could do to help themselves?
Yep. First and foremost is understand that working to unpack those narratives and to really examine how it's playing out is going to be uncomfortable. So getting comfortable with the sense of discomfort, so that knot in your stomach, that flight or fight response often comes along. The physical response is often something that comes along with the experience of IP. That toe curling, the making yourself smaller, and all of this tense body language that comes along with the cognitive experience of this is something that you need to get to grips with. So things like just obviously getting a coach or a mentor is really very useful, but that does mean that you're going to have to put yourself out there. Often coaches or mentors who are outside of your sphere of your usual context, for example. So there's been some research done, particularly with students, the way you take the student out of their peer group and you put them in an out of peer group space where they're not necessarily competing with those people in terms of success. So you might take a business student out of business and stick them with an engineering student. They're now not in competition with each other. So for the business student to say, oh, look, this is how I feel, this is the type of stuff that I'm experiencing, they're not necessarily going to be feeling like the engineering student is going to be judging them on their lack of what they perceive to be their lack of business acumen, because they're not in the same space. So getting people outside of that peer group to be a mentor or getting a coach who can unpack these stories and ask the question, is that true? So, I mean, it's a perfect question to ask. I know that I'm going to be found out, and all that track record of success that I have stretching behind me is to do with luck, or I was in the right place at the right time, or people are just being kind to me. To say to someone, is that true, stops you in your tracks.
Oh, it does.
Because you're forced into going, is it really? Well, where's the evidence? So mentors and coaches can put in front of you absolute objective evidence to say, that project you did came in on time, in on budget, the customer was absolutely thrilled with it, and that was all on you, and here is the evidence. Now, toes will be curling, flight or fight response will be happening in the pit of the stomach. But having somebody put that in front of you and say, here is the truth, that is the start of actually unraveling some of those internal narratives and accepting that, I mean, one of the key characteristics of IP is being unable to internalize your own successes and amplifying failures as your own doing, where in fact they're not. So there's a perfect question that you have locked away in your own mind saying, is the thought that I'm having now, is that true? Is it true that someone's going to laugh in my face? Is it true that this accolade that I've just received was because people were just being nice to me? Stepping back outside of your immediate experience and saying, is that true? Where's the evidence? And sort of having a bit of a good hard talk to yourself is also one of those things that is difficult to do, but also is quite useful. Some people found success with putting it outside of themselves. And so that inner monologue that tells you this in because someone's gonna laugh in my face, or the external examiners are gonna find out that I should never have been doing this, or I shouldn't have really got this job because clearly I don't have the experience or the qualifications to do it. Putting it outside of themselves and saying that is a voice that belongs to that imposter that sits on my shoulder. That's not me. And so you're starting to externalize that voice rather than keeping it in your own head and making it true. Other things that people find success with is having putting a boundary around their worry time. So one person I spoke to said that when they get up in the morning and they know that they're going to have these sorts of thoughts during the day, they say, right, okay, if I'm going to have these thoughts anyway, I'm going to have them while I'm in the shower. And the minute I get out of the shower, that's me done. So I'm allowing myself the opportunity to run through these things, but then I'm going to leave it behind. And so again, that's not something that is going to happen overnight. That's something you practice on a daily basis. Other things, you might go to a coach and you might cognitive behavior therapy. That's sort of on the way out, or has been challenged. Acceptance commitment therapy, building psychological capital, so elevating your capacities for hope, optimism, self-efficacy, and resilience, for example. So there are a bunch of different things that people can do, but at the heart of it is challenging those narratives. And however you can really examine them, take a step back and ask yourself, is this true? It's a perfect question to ask to get you started.
And I think for me, having someone outside of everything was really helpful. And I think a coach, whenever you see a coach, they're able to ask you the questions that no one else can ask. Because if you go to a family member and have this conversation, I know if I'd spoken to anyone in my family, they'd have been like, oh no, you'll be fine and all of that, because it comes from a different place. And that's lovely. That kind of unconditional support is amazing. And I've been lucky to have so much of it. But sometimes you do actually need someone to really challenge it and to go, instead of saying, oh, don't worry, to go, okay, let's look at that. Let's be uncomfortable, and it is, and sit with that for a bit, and let's examine it. And I think it's that bringing it into the light and examining it from all angles, for me, was and continues to be the thing that really helps.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And it's something that I say in some of my workshops is that, and people sort of look at me weirdly when I say this, is if you're going to get a mentor, somebody who perhaps is in your workplace, and if you're, because obviously coaching and mentoring are different things, but if you're going to get a mentor, find someone that has no interest in being nice to you. And I say that because people who experience IP are experts at wriggling out of that, that objective feedback. They are experts at wriggling out the evidence. And so if you find someone that is your friend, or who has some sort of, perhaps even, a surface level emotional connection to you, you as someone experiencing IP will go, oh, well, they're just being nice. Yeah. In your quiet moments, oh, they're just saying that because they're my friend. If you know that the person has no interest, has no alternative agenda of being nice to you, and are going to tell it to you like it is, then it's so much more difficult to wriggle out of that or use that excuse that they're just being kind to me. they had to say that because they didn't want to hurt my feelings. Well, if they know that that person has no agenda and is able to put that objective evidence in front of you without fear of perhaps making you uncomfortable, well, that's going to be more beneficial in some ways than getting someone who's going to say, "Oh, Susanne, you're fabulous and you always are." That is, it's like, just stab me now.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
And you don't
my God, you
listen.
think I'm fabulous? I'm going to have to keep that up.
Yeah,
You're going to
exactly.
expect me to keep being fabulous. I'm not sure that I can carry that.
For the rest of my life.
You as well. Oh no. So,
Yeah,
yeah, getting somebody who's not afraid to put objective evidence in front of you about that track record of success that's stretching behind you that you can't see, but everybody else can see. That's a good place to start, but it is uncomfortable.
it is, but worth it. And I think for me, anything where you're unpacking something, it's always uncomfortable. But I talk a lot in my work about difficult conversations, which is a phrase I absolutely hate because it makes
Yeah.
people, I'm on a crusade against it, like you are with imposter syndrome, but it makes people not want to do it. And they're not difficult. They make us feel uncomfortable, and we have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's really
Yep.
important. So I
Yeah.
think, yeah, it's good advice.
I think over time that discomfort diminishes.
Mm,
If you really front up to it and you start doing all sorts of different things and you start challenging your emotions, you start challenging those thought patterns and you start unpacking your learned narratives. And then you start recognizing, well, okay, the performance management process at work, it sort of lends itself to me feeling uncomfortable, or the promotion and pay negotiation puts me in a position where I continually feel other because it's a poorly structured process. Then you can start saying, "Oh, okay, well, that's not in my head. That's an actual thing.
yeah.
That's something out in the world that is actually making or contributing to my experiences and my perceptions of feeling like a fake and a fraud." So there's one thing to understand what's going on in your own mind and rebounding off your own stories, but also it's looking at what's going on in the context and recognizing that it is out in the world as well as in you as well. So, and that some things you might have to say, okay, well, if I'm feeling like that because that system, that structure, that behavior of somebody else is actually making a contribution to my sense of discomfort with my own achievements.
So I think going back to the organizational level then, you were talking about the most recent research is looking at the kind of structural things
Yeah.
that impact on this. What is it that organizations need to be thinking about, or leaders in organizations need to be thinking about because of imposter phenomenon?
Yeah, I think just understanding that it's it is a thing,
Mm.
and like your 70% of all change management practices going wrong. The figures that are bandied about, coincidentally, there was one piece of research that keeps getting resurrected, that 70% of people will experience imposter phenomenon. And that was true for that study. But if you look at other studies, it could be as low, in the single digits.
Mm.
And others, particularly in the stuff that I was looking at of women in STEM, you're looking into the 90%
Wow.
of people actually experiencing this at one point or another, moderately or intensely. So we're looking at people who are not just experiencing it now and again, but are experiencing it either daily, like some of the people that I was speaking to, or sort of fairly regularly. So understanding that there's a bunch of people in your workplace who are coming to work feeling like this is the day that they're going to get found out, or the next promotion I take is going to be the promotion that is going to put me in a position where I'm going to be more visible, and therefore that's when I'm going to get found out. So you know what? I'm just going to bob along under the radar here because I know that the next step that I take is going to be the one where I'm really I've fooled everybody and I will continue to fool everybody, but at some point or another, I'm going to get that tap on the shoulder and being told that I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So there are people in the workplace who are feeling like that on a regular basis. And some of the things that organizations are doing are fueling that. So, for example, if you as a leader know that there is a person who is consistently high achieving, who is consistently hitting their KPIs, who is, for all intents and purposes, an extremely successful person at doing what they're doing and would be in line for some form of promotion or doing something different in the workplace, or having their experience elevated to a point where they might be able to, I don't know, improve their work experience or their career opportunities or pay, for example. And a promotion, say, comes along and that person doesn't apply. Not asking the question of, well, Susanne, we would have expected you to go for that job because you're perfectly qualified, you've got a track record of success identifying that you would be really good for this role. Why isn't it that you haven't gone for this role? And being sort of genuinely interested with a deep sense of empathy as to why you haven't stepped up. Now, it's unlikely that you as Susanne are going to sit there, oh, well, it's because I experienced the imposter phenomenon. It's unlikely that you're going to say that, but it might be, oh, look, I'm not qualified. I don't feel comfortable in doing this. So, sort of exploring that a little bit more with individuals rather than waiting for people to, pick me, because people who experience IP are not always going to stick their hands up. And indeed, even if they're tapped on the shoulder, they may turn really good opportunities down. Now, that has consequences for the individual because their capacity to elevate their careers, for example, might be diminished. It also means, and this came up more than on a few occasions with the conversations that I had with people, is that if they stay in the role, they get despondent and disparaged because they see people that they know to be less qualified overtaking them and having really good outcomes in terms of their career, for example. And so they often sit there sort of in Australia, there's a term called knitting yourself into a pair of barbed wire underpants. So you sit there sort of getting really bitter and twisted about your situation, but you know that you couldn't have gone for that role because that next role would be the point where you get found out. But simultaneously, you also think, I could do a better job than that person.
Yeah.
So there's this real paradox there. And so for the individual, and that's where you get stress, anxiety, depression, disengagement, turnover. So for the organisation, there's a whole bunch of capability that's sitting there latent that you are not able to tap into because the person doesn't feel comfortable putting themselves forward, or they're unable to internalise their own successes to suggest that they would be good in a different role or a different project or a promotional opportunity. And so we see people sitting sort of bobbing along in the middle and not perhaps being elevated into higher positions. One of the characteristics of IP is not wanting scrutiny. So if you're continually getting higher and higher in an organisation, that puts you in positions often where scrutiny becomes more a part of that role, particularly in leadership. You're under scrutiny, you're making decisions, you're out there, being, part and parcel of you might well be the face of the organisation. For people who experience IP, that scrutiny is like, no, I don't want to have, I want to know that I'm good enough to do that, but I don't want to be in a position where that talent is going to be scrutinised. So that's a real paradox. So organisations are missing out on latent talent, and in an environment where we continue to have capability and talent shortages, we can't afford to have talent either sitting in our organisations not being properly utilised and recognised, nor do we want people to say, you know what, I've reached the end of the road with this organisation. At some point or another, I'm going to get found out, so I'm just going to quietly go and work for somebody else. Sadly, the IP follows them.
Yes, I was going to say.
That's why they find this, similar sorts of situations elsewhere. So it's a double whammy. It's a double whammy. Yes, it has a profound impact on individuals, both personally and in career terms, but it also has an impact on workplaces. Now, coming back to the conversation around people who feel other, so it could be, women in leadership, for example. We know that women are underrepresented in boards all over the world. It's a global issue. Could it be that women are sitting there bobbing along under the radar saying, I can put myself into a position of leadership, but I'm going to continue to feel other. I'm going to continue to feel this sense of deep anxiety about my role. And I don't see anybody else like me there. So why would I put myself into that position? Alternatively, it could be people from non-traditional backgrounds. So people from low socioeconomic backgrounds in engineering, for example, we often see it there. People who are from culturally different backgrounds who don't see anybody like them will often be underrepresented in certain roles, and particularly in more elevated roles in organisations. So there are lots of consequences that perhaps have not necessarily been unpacked in the past because we thought that this thing was something that exists up here rather than out in the world.
That's so interesting. And I think I'm struck by what you were saying in terms of, as a leader and as a manager of people, you almost have to have that level of curiosity about your team so that you are interested in finding out why they're making some of these decisions, but also unafraid of having the conversations, because I can imagine a lot of managers would be like, oh, I don't want to have that conversation, because there could be lots of reasons why people didn't go for that promotion. But going back to that difficult, uncomfortable conversation thing, it's about saying to yourself, well, I need to talk to this person to understand why, and accept the consequences of that conversation. People are often afraid of emotion, well, they might cry, all that sort of thing. And I think actually as leaders and managers, we have a responsibility, because of everything that you've said, to be a bit more curious about what's going on for our teams.
Yeah, and I think, of late, the whole issue of, psychosocial safety and, providing a psychologically safe workplace. I mean, in Australia, it's law now that you have to have a psychosocially, a safe workplace. So having those conversations, knowing that it might be a bit emotional for people, it's, not to force the issue or to put people into a position where they are at risk, but to use some deep empathy and just ask the question. And even if you need to get assistance from other chapters in the organisation, you've got a people and culture team or a wellbeing team to lean on. You might want to seek some advice, but just being curious about that. Well, I would have expected that person to step up, and they're not. They would be actually quite capable and would actually do really well in that role. I wonder what's going on here. It might not be that the person is experienced. They might have a whole raft of other matters going on that doesn't make it right for them at that time. But at least you've asked the question. And so also coming back to the point about really scrutinizing systems and processes. So particularly if there is a team in place, such as people and culture, really sort of examining what is going on at the grassroots level, or at the coalface, where these systems are actually hitting the ground and actually really being put into practice. Is there something that you could do to minimize this sense of otherness? EDI and belonging programs, that's what they're charged with doing. So you're scooping up a lot of the stuff that would minimize the risk of people feeling like an imposter, even though they're not. They're, as I said, most likely to be very high achieving individuals. It scoops up a whole raft of structural bias or implicit bias in systems and processes and behaviours of others that do good for a whole bunch of other people as well.
Yes.
So it sort of makes sense to look at it as an EDIB issue, as well as trying to extend opportunities for people who may not have had opportunities in the past, who have been locked out of certain roles or certain occupations or certain spaces in our communities.
Wow. There's a lot to think about. I can't quite believe we've come to the end of our recording. We've run out of time. I could talk about this.
Isn't that just when people sort of feel a bit uncomfortable with their own achievements and they feel like a fake? Yeah, it is that, but it is so much more.
And I think that point about it isn't just in someone's head is such an important point to get across, because I think I liked what you were saying about how by making it an individual thing, it's their problem to solve. And there is work to do for yourself, but there's so much more to it. And that's such an important message.
Yeah, there's two sides of the coin, and you could quite happily do all the work on yourself. You could unpack your stories, you could challenge your assumptions, you could keep asking yourself, is this true? And go, actually, no, it isn't. I feel a bit better about my own achievements. And you could do all that work on yourself and diminish your experience of IP and understand how it works for you and get to grips with how it plays out in a cyclical process. But there's still going to be structural stuff that you may well be coming up against that you've got no control over. And so just recognizing that it's not all in your head and it's not coming from your own internal narratives, that it's out there in the world. You know, we have stories about the types of people who do certain roles and who should be in certain jobs and who should be getting certain accolades. You know, those sorts of narratives are very difficult to shift. I mean that's sort of, you know, a flash of the obvious, really. But it's those sorts of, you know, master social narratives that you're pushing up against as well. And so I think it gives people a little bit of comfort to know it's not all up here, it's out in the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really important message.
Yep.
So if people want to find out more about you and the wonderful work that you're doing, where should they go? Where should they go and look?
I have a website. It's a completely free website. There's no paywalls, there's no spam. It's called forfakesake.org. And it's sort of where I dump all of, you know, my media and my blogs and bits and things. And if people are interested, they can sign up for my blog, and they'll get information about, you know, bits and pieces that I'm doing, workshops and retreats and whatever. But as I said, it's totally free and you won't get spammed. So feel free to go and have a look at some of the material that's available there.
And there is lots of wonderful stuff on there. I have recommended it to lots of people.
Thank you.
You know, conversations I've had with organizations I work with and individuals where this comes up as a topic of conversation, and I always say, go there, there's loads of stuff. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it. Terri, it's been so wonderful talking to you today. I feel like we could have talked for hours and hours and hours. It's fascinating.
I could talk to you for a fortnight on this topic. It's so interesting.
Thank you so much for being my guest today.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.